1769. When the year 1769 began, Boston remained a city under the watch of British soldiers. The red-coated regiments that had arrived the previous autumn did not depart after restoring immediate order. Instead, they remained stationed in and around the town, maintaining a constant presence in the streets, near the harbor, and around the customs offices responsible for enforcing the Townshend duties. Their presence had become part of the city's daily life. Morning drills echoed through public squares. Patrols walked narrow colonial streets. Guards stood at strategic points near government buildings and along the waterfront. The routines of military discipline unfolded beside the rhythms of civilian commerce. Boston had adjusted to the sight of soldiers. But adjustment did not mean acceptance. Many residents believed the troops should never have been sent to the city at all. In their view, Boston had been governed through civil institutions for generations. Town meetings, assemblies, and colonial courts had long provided the mechanisms through which disputes were handled and laws enforced. The arrival of soldiers suggested that Britain no longer trusted those institutions. To imperial officials, however, the situation appeared very different. Reports sent to London described a city that had stabilized since the arrival of the regiments. Customs officers performed their duties with fewer interruptions. Large crowds no longer gathered around seizures of goods. The dramatic confrontations that had followed the Liberty Affair had faded. From this perspective, the presence of troops was working. The soldiers had not needed to fire their muskets. Their mere presence discouraged open resistance. Thus, the imperial strategy seemed effective. Maintain the duties. Maintain the troops. Allow time to weaken opposition. But time was also working on the colonists. While Boston remained outwardly calm, political organization across the colonies continued quietly. Non-importation agreements were still being discussed and enforced by merchants determined to pressure Britain economically. The soldiers had prevented riots. They had not ended resistance. Instead, the conflict had shifted into a quieter form. One side relied on discipline and military presence. The other relied on coordination and economic pressure. Boston, caught between the two, lived each day under the visible shadow of empire. While British soldiers patrolled the streets of Boston, colonial resistance took a different form. It moved through trade. The Townshend duties remained law in 1769. Glass, paper, paint, lead, and tea imported into the colonies were still subject to parliamentary taxation. Customs officials continued collecting those duties under the protection of British troops stationed in Boston. But colonial merchants were not passive participants in this system. Across the Atlantic coast, commercial networks began reinforcing the strategy that had first proven effective during the Stamp Act crisis: non-importation. Non-importation agreements were voluntary promises made by merchants not to import certain British goods. The goal was not immediate confrontation, but economic pressure. If British manufacturers lost colonial markets, they would pressure Parliament to reconsider the policies that had caused the disruption. By 1769, these agreements had spread across several major colonial ports. Merchants in Boston had already pledged to limit imports of goods subject to the Townshend duties. Similar agreements appeared in New York and Philadelphia. Committees formed to monitor compliance. Newspapers published lists of merchants who signed the agreements and those who refused. Public reputation became a powerful enforcement tool. A merchant who violated the agreement risked being publicly named in newspapers and boycotted by fellow traders. Communities sometimes refused to do business with those who undermined the collective effort. Economic discipline became a form of political resistance. The system required cooperation. Not every merchant supported the boycott. Some believed trade disruption harmed colonial prosperity more than it pressured Britain. Others feared losing market share to competitors willing to ignore the agreements. Yet enough merchants participated to make the movement visible. Warehouses in several ports held fewer British goods than in previous years. Orders sent across the Atlantic declined. British exporters noticed the change as shipments slowed. Colonial consumers also played a role. Patriot-minded buyers were encouraged to avoid imported goods whenever possible. Local manufacturing, though limited, gained symbolic importance. Wearing homespun clothing or purchasing locally produced items became small gestures of political loyalty. These actions did not shut down the colonial economy. Ships still sailed between Britain and the colonies. Trade continued in many forms. But the boycott created friction in the imperial commercial system. That friction mattered. Britain's relationship with its American colonies depended heavily on trade. Colonial markets consumed large quantities of British manufactured goods. When those markets contracted, even slightly, manufacturers and merchants in Britain felt the effect. Thus, by 1769, resistance was not centered only in Boston's streets. It extended through the entire Atlantic trading system. Merchants who never attended a town meeting still participated by refusing to import certain cargo. Consumers who never wrote political pamphlets still contributed by choosing which goods to purchase. Economic decisions became political statements. The British government believed the presence of troops would stabilize colonial unrest, but soldiers could not force merchants to place orders, and they could not force consumers to buy imported goods. Thus, the empire entered a new phase of conflict. The streets of Boston remained relatively calm. Yet, beneath that calm, a quiet economic struggle spread from port to port across the colonies. It was a struggle measured not in battles, but in cargo manifests and shipping ledgers. By the middle of 1769, the consequences of colonial non-importation began to appear in Britain. The effects were not dramatic at first. British manufacturers did not suddenly collapse. Trade between Britain and the colonies had not completely stopped. Ships still crossed the Atlantic, carrying goods in both directions. Yet something had changed. Orders from several colonial ports were smaller than in previous years. Merchants in London, Bristol, and Liverpool began noticing that colonial partners were requesting fewer shipments of manufactured goods. Warehouses that once expected regular demand from American ports now faced uncertainty about future orders. The difference was subtle but real. And in the world of commerce, subtle changes can create large concerns. Manufacturers who depended on colonial markets grew uneasy. Textile producers, metalworkers, and merchants whose goods once filled colonial ships began asking why demand had declined. Many traced the change back to the non-importation agreements spreading through the American colonies. The connection between colonial protest and British commerce was becoming clear. Colonial resistance was not limited to political speeches or pamphlets. It had entered the marketplace. British merchants began responding in the way merchants often do when their profits are threatened. They lobbied the government. Letters and petitions circulated among commercial associations. Merchants wrote to members of Parliament describing the difficulties created by declining colonial orders. Some warned that continued disruption could harm British workers whose livelihoods depended on overseas trade. These concerns reached Parliament. Debate over the Townshend duties intensified. Some members argued that the duties should remain in place to demonstrate the authority of Parliament. The Declaratory Act had already asserted that Parliament possessed the right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Retreating again, they warned, would weaken imperial authority and encourage further colonial resistance. Others saw the situation differently. They believed the duties were producing more trouble than revenue. The taxes themselves generated relatively small amounts of money. Yet the political and economic consequences of enforcing them had become significant. British troops were now stationed in Boston. Colonial merchants were limiting imports. British manufacturers were complaining about declining orders. To critics of the policy, the cost of maintaining the duties appeared increasingly high. Yet no immediate solution emerged. Parliament had to balance two competing concerns. On one side stood the principle of imperial authority. Many leaders believed that surrendering to colonial pressure would undermine Parliament's sovereignty over the empire. On the other side stood the practical reality of trade. Britain's economy benefited greatly from colonial markets. If the boycott continued to reduce commerce, the economic consequences could spread across British industries. Thus, by late 1769, debate in London reflected the same tension visible in the colonies. Authority versus stability. Principle versus profit. Neither side was ready to concede. The Townshend duties remained law. But the pressure surrounding them was no longer confined to American ports. It had reached the halls of Parliament and the warehouses of Britain itself. The empire's conflict had become truly Atlantic. What happened in Boston now influenced decisions in London, and decisions in London would determine the future of the colonies. As the year 1769 continued, the political conversation in the colonies grew louder and more coordinated. The presence of British troops in Boston remained the most visible symbol of imperial authority. Yet the debate surrounding that presence was no longer confined to Massachusetts. Newspapers, letters, and pamphlets carried descriptions of events in Boston to readers across the American colonies. Colonists in distant towns began discussing the situation as if it concerned them directly. In earlier decades, the colonies had often responded to imperial policy independently. A dispute affecting one colony might attract sympathy elsewhere, but coordinated action was rare. Geography, communication delays, and local political priorities tended to limit cooperation. The events of the late 1760s began to change that pattern. Merchants communicating through trade networks shared news quickly between ports. Newspapers reprinted articles from other colonies, allowing readers to follow developments far beyond their local communities. Political writers began framing colonial grievances as shared concerns rather than isolated disputes. Boston played a central role in this transformation. Because soldiers were stationed there, the city served as a visible example of what many colonists feared could happen if Parliament continued asserting authority without colonial consent. Pamphlets describing soldiers marching through Boston streets circulated widely. For some readers, these reports confirmed that imperial policy had moved beyond ordinary governance. For others, they represented a warning that political disagreements within the empire could escalate further if not resolved carefully. Colonial leaders recognized the importance of communication. Merchants enforcing non-importation agreements exchanged letters with counterparts in other cities to ensure that the boycott remained effective. Political organizations shared strategies for encouraging compliance and maintaining unity. These exchanges helped reinforce the idea that the colonies possessed common interests. They still remained separate political entities. Each colony had its own assembly, its own governor, and its own legal traditions. Yet the arguments surrounding the Townshend duties and the presence of troops encouraged colonists to think beyond those boundaries. A merchant in Philadelphia might now consider how events in Boston affected the entire colonial economy. A newspaper reader in New York might view British troops in Massachusetts as a development relevant to all British Americans. This expanding awareness did not immediately produce formal political union, but it created habits of shared discussion. Colonists began interpreting imperial policies not simply through local circumstances, but through their implications for the entire colonial world. British officials noticed this development. From London, reports described increasing coordination among colonial merchants and political leaders. The non-importation movement, though uneven, demonstrated the colony's growing ability to act collectively. To imperial administrators, this trend raised concern. If colonial opposition could be coordinated across provinces, enforcing parliamentary authority might become increasingly difficult. Yet, the British government also believed time would weaken this unity. Economic sacrifice was difficult to maintain. Merchants who lost profits might abandon non-importation agreements. Colonists who struggled to obtain imported goods might grow impatient with continued resistance. Thus, the empire entered a period of waiting. Colonists waited to see whether economic pressure would persuade Parliament to reconsider the Townshend duties. Parliament waited to see whether colonial unity would dissolve under the strain of prolonged resistance. Boston remained the most visible stage for this confrontation. But by 1769, the argument surrounding the city had become an argument about the future of the entire British Empire in America. By the latter part of 1769, the struggle between Britain and its American colonies had reached an unusual stage. The conflict had not exploded into rebellion, yet it had not been resolved either. Instead, the empire settled into something closer to a stalemate. In Boston, British troops remained stationed throughout the town. Their presence had become routine enough that daily life continued around them. Soldiers drilled in public spaces, guarded customs offices, and marched through the streets as part of their regular duties. The people of Boston had grown accustomed to seeing red coats, but familiarity did not mean comfort. Many residents still viewed the troops as an unnecessary and troubling presence. The soldiers had been sent to enforce parliamentary policies that colonists widely opposed. Their continued presence suggested that Britain had no intention of reconsidering those policies quickly. At the same time, the soldiers themselves had settled into the rhythms of garrison life. Military routines followed predictable patterns. Patrols were conducted. Guard shifts changed. Officers attempted to maintain discipline among the men under their command. From a strictly administrative perspective, the troops appeared to be doing their job. Large riots had not returned to Boston. Customs officers operated with fewer interruptions. Imperial officials reported that the situation remained under control. Yet beneath this surface calm, the deeper conflict remained unresolved. The Townshend duties still applied to imported goods. Colonial merchants still attempted to enforce non-importation agreements. British manufacturers still worried about declining colonial orders, and Parliament still debated whether maintaining the duties was worth the political cost. Each side believed time might eventually work in its favor. British officials believed colonial resistance would weaken as merchants grew tired of lost profits and consumers grew impatient with shortages of imported goods. Colonial leaders believed economic pressure would eventually persuade British merchants to demand change from Parliament. Thus, the empire entered a waiting period. Neither side possessed a decisive advantage. The British government held legal authority and military power. The colonies possessed economic leverage and growing political unity. Boston remained the focal point where these forces met. The soldiers stationed there symbolized imperial determination. The merchants enforcing boycotts symbolized colonial resistance. For the moment, neither symbol prevailed. The empire continued functioning, but under increasing strain. Trade moved across the Atlantic. Political arguments filled newspapers. Soldiers marched through Boston's streets, and colonists continued debating their rights as British subjects. The year 1769 did not bring dramatic turning points. Instead, it revealed how deeply the conflict between Britain and its American colonies had taken root. What had begun as disputes over taxation had evolved into a struggle over authority, representation, and the future structure of the empire itself. Both sides now understood that the disagreement could not be resolved easily. The empire had entered a period of endurance. Each side waited to see which would break first. As 1769 continued, the unity that had powered the non-importation movement began to face strain. The boycott of British goods required discipline among merchants across multiple colonial ports. Each merchant who agreed to limit imports relied on others to do the same. If too many traders ignored the agreements, those who complied risked losing customers and profits. For a time, the system held. Public pressure and shared political goals helped maintain cooperation. Merchants who violated the agreements could find themselves criticized in newspapers or avoided by fellow traders. Reputation mattered deeply in colonial commercial life, and many merchants preferred to maintain solidarity rather than face public criticism. Yet economic reality remained difficult to ignore. Trade was the lifeblood of the port cities. Boston, New York, and Philadelphia depended on a steady flow of goods across the Atlantic. Limiting imports meant limiting profits, and not every merchant was willing to sustain those losses indefinitely. Debates began appearing within merchant communities. Some argued that the boycott had already achieved its purpose by demonstrating colonial unity. Others insisted that abandoning the agreements too soon would weaken the pressure on Parliament and make the sacrifices already made meaningless. The disagreement did not erupt into open conflict, but it introduced uncertainty. Meetings among merchants grew more contentious. Ledgers and shipping plans were reviewed carefully as traders considered whether continuing the boycott served their long-term interests. Some merchants quietly resumed certain forms of trade, while others remained firmly committed to non-importation. This division revealed an important truth about colonial resistance. Unity was powerful, but it was also fragile. The boycott movement relied on voluntary cooperation rather than formal law. Without constant encouragement and shared commitment, economic pressures could slowly erode that cooperation. British officials followed these developments with interest. Reports from colonial ports suggested that the boycott was beginning to weaken in some areas. If colonial merchants gradually returned to normal trade patterns, the economic pressure on British manufacturers would diminish. To imperial leaders, this possibility reinforced their belief that time remained on Britain's side. Colonial resistance might appear strong in the short term, But sustained economic sacrifice could be difficult to maintain. Thus, as 1769 progressed, the conflict between Britain and its American colonies entered another subtle phase. Resistance had not ended, but the unity that supported it faced new tests. The empire continued functioning, yet beneath its surface lay a growing question. How long could colonial cooperation endure under the weight of economic strain? By the later months of 1769, signs appeared that the non-importation movement was beginning to lose momentum. The boycott had placed pressure on British trade and demonstrated the colonies' ability to act together. Yet maintaining such a system required constant vigilance and continued sacrifice. For merchants whose livelihoods depended on commerce, the costs were significant. Orders that once crossed the Atlantic regularly had slowed. Warehouses in colonial ports sometimes stood partially empty of British goods. Customers searching for familiar imported items occasionally found fewer options available. These shortages produced frustration. Some colonists remained firmly committed to the boycott, viewing it as a necessary sacrifice to defend colonial rights. Others began to question whether continued economic disruption served a useful purpose if Parliament showed no immediate sign of retreating. The result was a gradual weakening of the agreements. Not all merchants abandoned non-importation at once. Instead, the change occurred unevenly. In some ports, traders quietly resumed importing certain goods. In others, enforcement of the agreements grew less strict as attention shifted toward other concerns. This unevenness mattered. The effectiveness of the boycott depended on widespread participation. When some merchants returned to trade while others continued limiting imports, the collective pressure on Britain diminished. British manufacturers noticed the shift. Orders from the colonies began to recover slightly in certain sectors. Though trade had not returned fully to earlier levels, the signs of renewed commerce suggested that the colonial boycott might not endure indefinitely. To British officials observing from London, these developments seemed to confirm their expectations. Colonial resistance, they believed, could not be sustained forever. Economic interests would eventually encourage merchants to resume trade. Consumers eager for imported goods would place pressure on those merchants to restore normal commercial patterns. Yet even as the boycott weakened, its political impact remained. Colonists had demonstrated that they possessed the ability to organize economic resistance across multiple provinces. The experience created networks of communication and cooperation that would not easily disappear. Moreover, the presence of British troops in Boston ensured that the political argument underlying the boycott remained visible. The issue had never been solely about trade. It concerned the authority of Parliament to tax the colonies without representation and the willingness of the empire to enforce that authority through military power. Thus, by the end of 1769, the boycott no longer appeared as unified as it had once been. But the ideas that had produced it remained firmly rooted in colonial political thought. Economic pressure might fluctuate. The underlying conflict continued. While colonial merchants debated the future of the boycott, one fact remained unchanged in Boston. The soldiers were still there. British regiments continued occupying positions throughout the city, as they had since their arrival in the autumn of 1768. Patrols moved through the streets. Guards stood near customs offices and government buildings. Military drills echoed across open spaces where civilians conducted their daily routines. Their presence had become part of the city's landscape. Residents walking to the docks passed soldiers standing watch. Merchants conducting business in the harbor district saw red-coated patrols moving along nearby streets. Even public gatherings took place with the knowledge that troops were stationed only blocks away. The arrangement produced an uneasy balance. Boston had not descended into open violence. Yet neither had the presence of troops resolved the political dispute that had brought them there. Imperial officials viewed the situation as evidence that their strategy was working. The soldiers provided a visible reminder of British authority, while allowing civil administration to continue functioning. Customs officers performed their duties under military protection, and the dramatic confrontations that had once erupted along the waterfront no longer appeared as frequently. But many colonists interpreted the situation differently. To them, the presence of troops in a civilian city represented a troubling shift in the nature of imperial governance. The empire that had once relied on shared political traditions now appeared increasingly willing to enforce its policies through military power. The soldiers themselves often stood at the center of this tension. Most had been sent to Boston, simply to follow orders. They carried out drills, maintained guard posts, and attempted to avoid unnecessary confrontation with civilians. Yet their uniforms and muskets symbolized a deeper conflict that extended far beyond the city's streets. Every patrol reminded residents that imperial authority now possessed a physical form. Boston continued to function as a commercial port. Ships arrived. Cargo moved along the docks. Markets opened each morning. Yet the underlying disagreement between Britain and its American colonies remained unresolved. The soldiers ensured that this disagreement could never fade entirely into the background. Their presence kept the question of authority visible. The empire might appear stable on the surface, but beneath that stability lay a conflict that neither side had yet managed to settle. By the closing months of 1769, the debate surrounding the Townshend duties had intensified within Britain itself. The policies that Parliament had enacted only a few years earlier were now producing consequences that stretched across the Atlantic world. British troops remained stationed in Boston. Colonial merchants had organized boycotts that disrupted trade. Political arguments about taxation and authority filled newspapers on both sides of the ocean. Within Parliament, opinions about the duties were far from unified. Some members believed that maintaining the taxes was essential to preserving imperial authority. The Declaratory Act had already affirmed Parliament's right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. If Britain abandoned the Townshend duties under colonial pressure, critics warned, it might encourage further resistance in the future. To them, retreat would signal weakness. Yet other voices raised practical concerns. The duties themselves produced relatively little revenue for the empire, compared with the vast costs of administering and defending colonial territories. The income generated by taxes on glass, paper, paint, lead, and tea was modest. At the same time, the political consequences of enforcing those duties had become substantial. British soldiers were stationed in Boston. Colonial merchants had organized economic resistance. British manufacturers complained about declining orders from American ports. For many observers, the situation appeared increasingly inefficient. A tax system designed to raise revenue had instead generated political conflict, military expense, and commercial disruption. Some members of Parliament began questioning whether maintaining the duties truly served Britain's broader imperial interests. These discussions did not immediately produce a decision. Parliament rarely moved quickly on matters that involved both economic and constitutional principles. The issue touched on questions of authority, representation, and the long-term structure of the British Empire. Still, the conversation had changed. When the Townshend duties were first introduced, they had been presented as a reasonable method of raising revenue while asserting parliamentary authority. By the end of 1769, they had become a source of ongoing controversy that reached far beyond the customs houses of colonial ports. British leaders now faced a dilemma. Maintaining the duties risked prolonging colonial resistance and economic disruption. Repealing them risked encouraging the belief that Parliament could be forced to retreat whenever colonial opposition became strong enough. Neither option appeared simple. Thus, as the year drew toward its close, Parliament continued debating how best to manage the empire's relationship with its American colonies. The decision had not yet been made, but the pressure surrounding the Townshend duties was steadily increasing, and that pressure would soon lead to change. By the end of 1769, the British Empire in North America stood in a delicate balance. The conflict between Britain and its colonies had not escalated into open rebellion. Trade continued to move across the Atlantic. Colonial governments still operated under the authority of royal governors and imperial law. Yet the relationship between Britain and the colonies had clearly changed. Just a decade earlier, many colonists had rarely questioned the structure of the empire. They identified strongly as British subjects and took pride in belonging to one of the most powerful political systems in the world. Now that confidence had begun to shift, the debates surrounding the Stamp Act and the Townshend duties had forced colonists to examine the foundations of imperial authority. Questions about taxation, representation, and the limits of parliamentary power were discussed not only by political leaders, but by merchants, artisans, and ordinary citizens. The presence of British troops in Boston gave those debates a physical dimension. Political arguments were no longer confined to pamphlets and assemblies. Soldiers stationed within a colonial city reminded residents that imperial authority could be enforced through military power if necessary. Yet Britain had not attempted to crush colonial resistance outright. Parliament continued debating policy. British merchants still traded with colonial partners. Imperial officials attempted to maintain order while avoiding actions that might provoke greater unrest. This cautious approach reflected the complexity of the empire itself. Britain's American colonies were valuable economic partners and strategic territories. Governing them required balancing authority with cooperation. Too much pressure could provoke resistance. Too little could weaken imperial control. Thus, by the end of 1769, both sides were testing the limits of that balance. Colonists continued asserting what they believed were their rights as British subjects. British officials continued asserting Parliament's authority over the empire. The result was an uneasy equilibrium. Neither side had fully surrendered its position. Neither side had achieved decisive victory. Instead, the empire had entered a period of tension in which each development, each new tax, each protest, each political decision carried the potential to shift the balance. Boston remained the most visible stage for this struggle, but the argument itself now extended across the entire Atlantic world. The empire continued functioning. Yet beneath its surface lay a growing uncertainty about how long that balance could endure. End of the year 1769.